Abigail Thompson watches in stunned silence as airport security escorts the entire cabin crew off her flight. 20 minutes ago, they refused her a glass of water. Now, every single one of them carries termination letters. She never imagined asking for basic human dignity would cost 12 people their careers in less than half an hour. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of their race or position, smash that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories about justice and accountability. Now, let's go back to the beginning and see exactly how a simple request for water turned into a career-ending disaster for an entire flight crew. Abigail Thompson stood in the boarding area at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, adjusting the collar of her tailored navy blazer. At 38 years old, she was the CEO of Thomson Tech Solutions, a software company worth $200 million with 350 employees spread across 4 offices. The merger she'd just closed after 3 sleepless nights had been grueling, and this 5-hour first-class flight to San Francisco represented her first chance to breathe in 72 hours. Her diamond earrings caught the early morning light as she shifted her leather briefcase, stamped with her company logo, from one hand to the other. Her natural hair was styled in elegant locks that fell past her shoulders, a statement of professional pride and cultural identity she'd worked years to feel confident wearing in corporate spaces. The 6:30 a.m. flight was boarding early, and Abigail appreciated the relative quiet of the first-class line. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, received a polite nod, and walked down the jet bridge. The August heat hadn't yet invaded the air-conditioned tunnel, and she felt her shoulders start to relax for the first time all week. Seat 2A, window seat, exactly what she'd requested. She loved watching the world shrink below during takeoff, the way Atlanta's sprawl would give way to clouds and sky. As she entered the aircraft, the cabin was nearly empty, just 2 other passengers already settled in their seats near the front. The new plane smell mixed with filtered air, and she moved down the aisle toward her row. That's when she first noticed Ada. The lead flight attendant was a white woman in her early 40s with blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. Her cold blue eyes swept over Abigail with an expression that wasn't quite hostile but certainly wasn't welcoming. Abigail had seen that look countless times throughout her career, that split-second assessment that seemed to calculate whether she belonged in spaces reserved for a certain kind of person. She pushed the feeling aside, told herself she was being oversensitive after such an exhausting week, and focused on reaching her row. She lifted her briefcase into the overhead compartment, settling into the leather seat that still had that showroom firmness, and pulled out her tablet to review some documents before the flight took off. But Ada appeared at her row within seconds, stopping in the aisle and staring pointedly at Abigail's boarding pass, then at the seat number above, then back at the boarding pass. She did this 3 times, her movements deliberate and loud enough that the 2 passengers in row 1 turned to look. "This really is your seat?" Ada asked, her voice carrying an undertone Abigail couldn't quite identify but definitely didn't like. Abigail maintained her composure, reaching for the professionalism that had carried her through countless uncomfortable situations. "Yes, seat 2A, she responded with a polite smile, holding up her boarding pass again. Ada studied it for another moment that stretched too long, then walked away without another word. No, welcome aboard, no, can I help you get settled, nothing that resembled the hospitality first-class passengers typically received. 3 other flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for boarding. Abel, a white man in his 30s with sharp features and constantly moving hands. Aaron, another white man, older, with gray at his temples and a permanent expression of mild irritation. Adelaide, a white woman in her 20s with red hair and freckles who seemed to take cues from Ada's behavior. Abigail watched them exchange glances as they passed her row, watched them lean together and whisper while looking in her direction. She'd developed a sixth sense for these moments over 2 decades in tech, an industry not known for its welcoming attitude toward black women. But she'd built her company from nothing, survived hostile investors and dismissive competitors, and she certainly wasn't going to let some flight attendants ruin her morning. The boarding process accelerated. First-class passengers filed in, a parade of business suits and casual wealth. Ada transformed for each of them. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Peterson," she chirped to a silver-haired man settling into row 1. "Can I help you with that bag, Mrs. Chen?" she asked a well-dressed woman in row 3, already reaching for the carry-on. "Let me get you some champagne right away," she promised a couple taking seats in row 4. The warmth flowed freely, the professional hospitality that justified the premium ticket price. But when Abigail attempted to make eye contact, needing to ask about the faulty reading light above her seat, Ada suddenly became very busy adjusting an overhead bin that was already perfectly organized. Abel walked past without acknowledging her outstretched hand. Aaron examined his tablet with intense focus despite standing directly beside her row. Adelaide studied the safety card she'd probably memorized years ago. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every passenger received a greeting, an offer of assistance, a smile. Every passenger except Abigail. She watched Ada approach with a tray of champagne flutes, the bubbles catching the cabin lights, condensation forming on the crystal-clear glass. The flight attendant moved methodically down the aisle, handing glasses to row 1, pausing to chat with the couple about their destination, moving to row 3 with another warm exchange about the beautiful San Francisco weather forecast. As Ada reached row 2, Abigail straightened in her seat, ready to accept the offered beverage. But Ada's eyes slid past her as if she were invisible, and the flight attendant stepped directly to row 3 behind her. "Here you are, enjoy," she told the businessmen settling in, her voice syrupy sweet. Abigail looked down at the tray as Ada passed back up the aisle. 6 glasses had been on it when the service started. Now only 1 remained, and Ada was heading back to the galley. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had been announced over the intercom. "You don't belong here." The shame that tried to rise in Abigail's chest met the steel she'd forged through years of similar moments. This wasn't her shame to carry. This was their failure, their prejudice, their small-minded cruelty. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, beginning to document everything with timestamps. Professional habits died hard, and she had a feeling she'd need the record. The aircraft pushed back from the gate right on schedule, the tug pulling them away from the terminal as engines began their distinctive whine. Through her window, Abigail watched ground crews in neon vests directing the backward motion with practiced hand signals. The plane pivoted, then began rolling forward under its own power, joining the queue of aircraft waiting for takeoff clearance. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional and calm, announcing the flight time of 4 hours and 53 minutes, the route over Texas and New Mexico, the clear skies awaiting them in San Francisco. Normal. Everything seemed normal except for the cold void of service surrounding seat 2A. Abigail pressed her call button. The small light above her seat illuminated, a silent request for assistance. She needed water, her mouth dry from the recycled terminal air and insufficient sleep. The light stayed on. 1 minute passed, then 3, then 5. She could see all 4 flight attendants in the forward galley, visible through the gap in the curtain separating first class from the cockpit area. They were chatting, laughing about something, completely relaxed. 7 minutes. Abel walked past her row carrying a tray of cocktail napkins to replenish the stock in the rear galley. His eyes never moved toward her illuminated call button. 8 minutes. Adelaide came through with a trash bag, collecting the plastic cups from the champagne service Abigail had never received. The young flight attendant's gaze stayed fixed straight ahead as she passed row 2. Abigail unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The plane was still taxiing, moving at walking speed as it navigated the complex network of taxiways leading to the runway. She steadied herself against the seat back and took 2 steps toward the galley. Ada materialized immediately, stepping into the aisle with the authority of someone defending territory. "Passengers must remain seated during taxi," she announced loudly, her voice carrying to nearby rows. Several passengers looked up from their phones and tablets. Abigail kept her tone level, professional, the voice she used in boardrooms when dealing with difficult personalities. "I just need a bottle of water. I've had my call button on for 8 minutes." Ada's expression hardened, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "We're preparing for takeoff. Return to your seat immediately." The command hung in the air between them, sharp-edged and unambiguous. Abigail nodded slowly, recognizing a battle not worth fighting at this moment, and returned to 2A. She buckled in and watched. Watched as a passenger in row 4 pressed his call button. Watched as Ada responded within 30 seconds, all smiles and accommodation, delivering a gin and tonic with a cheerful, "Absolutely, sir, my pleasure." The contrast was so blatant, so undeniable, that Abigail almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Almost. The plane reached the runway, engines building to a roar that drowned out all other sound. Abigail felt the familiar push back into her seat as they accelerated, the sensation of speed translating into lift, and then the ground falling away. Atlanta became a patchwork of buildings and roads and green spaces, shrinking beneath them as they climbed through 6,000 feet, 8,000, 10,000. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated longer than usual, the captain noting some light chop expected at cruising altitude. Abigail used the time to review emails on her tablet, trying to focus on work rather than the growing hunger in her stomach. She'd skipped breakfast in her rush to the airport after an early morning call with Tokyo partners. That was 15 hours ago now. Dinner had been a protein bar at her hotel desk. Finally, the seatbelt sign chimed off. Within minutes, Abel and Adelaide emerged from the galley pushing a cart laden with covered trays. The breakfast service had begun, and the aroma of warm bread and coffee filled the cabin. Abigail's stomach responded immediately, a reminder of just how long it had been since she'd eaten a real meal. She watched the cart progress down the aisle, watched Adelaide remove the foil covers with a flourish to reveal omelets and fresh fruit and pastries still steaming. "We have the vegetable frittata or the smoked salmon plate this morning," Adelaide explained to each passenger, her voice bright and engaging. "And of course fresh squeezed orange juice, coffee, or tea." The cart stopped at row 1. Full service, complete attention, warm interaction. Then it rolled forward to row 3. Abigail blinked, certain she'd misunderstood what just happened. But no, the cart was now positioned beside the businessman behind her, Adelaide already removing a tray. "We have the vegetable frittata or the smoked salmon plate," the flight attendant repeated her script. Abigail leaned forward slightly, catching Adelaide's eye. "Excuse me," she said quietly, not wanting to cause a scene. Adelaide's gaze flickered over her and away, as if she'd looked at empty air. The passenger in seat 2B, a white businessman named Aaron in a gray suit, noticed the omission. He leaned across the empty middle seat. "Excuse me, I think you forgot this row." Adelaide finally acknowledged row 2, but her eyes stayed fixed on Aaron, never moving to Abigail. "We're out of breakfast options. She'll have to wait for second service." The lie was so transparent, so obviously false, that Aaron's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Abigail could see at least 4 trays remaining on the cart. She watched Adelaide and Abel serve 3 more rows, watched them distribute 6 more breakfast plates, watched the cart return to the galley still holding 2 covered trays. Not out of options. Just out of willingness to serve a black woman in seat 2A. The documentation in Abigail's notes app grew more detailed. Time stamps, direct quotes, witnesses. Her years as CEO had taught her the power of meticulous records. Words against words meant nothing, but documented patterns with multiple witnesses meant everything. Aaron was getting visibly agitated beside her, his breakfast sitting untouched on his tray table. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, loud enough for Abigail to hear. "I'm going to complain." Abigail gave him a small smile, appreciating the solidarity even as she knew complaints from passengers of color rarely went anywhere. "Thank you," she said simply, "but I've seen this before." Her stomach growled again, a physical reminder of the basic need being deliberately denied. 17 hours now since dinner. Aaron looked at his plate, then at Abigail, then back at his plate. He made a decision. Here, he said, pushing his tray slightly in her direction. I'm not that hungry anyway. Please. The gesture touched something deep in Abigail, this stranger willing to sacrifice his meal out of basic human decency. Before she could respond, Ada appeared as if summoned by some alarm only she could hear. Passengers are not permitted to share airline meals, the lead flight attendant announced, her voice sharp and carrying. It's a health code violation. Aaron's face flushed red, but with anger rather than embarrassment. I've flown 200 flights and never heard that rule. He stood, his 6-foot frame imposing in the narrow aisle. Ada didn't back down, crossing her arms and staring up at him. Well, maybe you need to fly more expensive airlines, she said, her eyes cutting deliberately to Abigail as she spoke. The implication landed like a slap. You brought someone who doesn't belong here into our expensive space. The racism wasn't even subtle anymore, wasn't even trying to hide behind policy or procedure. It stood naked in the aisle of a first-class cabin at 35,000 feet, daring anyone to call it by name. 2 hours into the flight, Abigail had received exactly nothing. No food, no beverage, no acknowledgement of her existence beyond hostile stares and deliberate avoidance. Around her, other passengers were on their second round of drinks. The couple in row 4 had ordered Bloody Marys after finishing mimosas. The woman in row 1 was sipping her third cup of coffee. Aaron beside her nursed a whiskey, having given up on breakfast after Ada's intervention. His meal eventually cleared away untouched in a silent protest Abigail appreciated but hadn't asked for. Her head throbbed now, dehydration combining with hunger and accumulated stress to create a pain that pulsed behind her eyes. She pressed the call button again, watching the light illuminate with a soft glow that seemed to mock her with its cheerful color. 15 minutes. The button stayed lit, a small red beacon of distress that every flight attendant seemed professionally trained to ignore. Abigail could see all 4 crew members clearly through the galley curtain. Ada was reading something on her phone, laughing. Abel was eating what looked like a sandwich, probably his crew meal. Aaron was organizing supplies in the overhead compartments. Adelaide was fixing her hair in a small compact mirror. Normal workday activities during a lull in service. Except one passenger still had an illuminated call button they were all pretending not to see. Abigail made another decision. She wasn't going to sit here and die of thirst to make them comfortable. She unbuckled, stood, and walked down the aisle toward the galley. Ada saw her coming. Abigail watched the flight attendant's expression shift from relaxed to hostile, watched her straighten and plant herself in the galley entrance like a guard at a gate. The other 3 crew members noticed the approaching passenger and moved closer, forming a wall of navy blue uniforms and closed expressions. Abigail stopped a respectful distance away, keeping her voice calm and clear. Excuse me, I've been trying to get some water for over 2 hours. Could I please have a bottle? Simple request. Basic human need. The kind of thing that should take 30 seconds to fulfill and require no conflict whatsoever. But Ada didn't move to get water. Instead, she looked Abigail up and down slowly, deliberately, her gaze traveling from the locks Abigail wore with pride to the designer blazer to the leather shoes and back up again. Are you sure you're in the right cabin? Ada asked, her voice dripping with false concern. Economy is behind that curtain. She gestured with one manicured hand toward the rear of the aircraft. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, visible and choking. Abel smirked. Adelaide covered her mouth but couldn't quite hide her smile. Aaron, the male flight attendant, crossed his arms and nodded slightly, as if his colleague had made an excellent point. Abigail felt the moment expand, felt the weight of every similar interaction she'd endured compress into this single exchange. Every time someone assumed she was the assistant, not the CEO. Every time someone asked if she was lost when she walked into executive meetings. Every time someone touched her hair without permission or spoke to her as if she were a child or questioned whether she'd really earned her position. She took a breath, held it for 3 seconds, and released it slowly. When she spoke, her voice was steady, professional, controlled. "I'm in seat 2A. I purchased a first-class ticket. I'm simply asking for water." Each word distinct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Ada's expression shifted from condescending to openly contemptuous. First-class passengers don't usually need to be reminded of proper etiquette. Perhaps you're not accustomed to this level of service. The emphasis on "accustomed" made the racist subtext into text. You don't belong here because people who look like you don't belong in spaces like this. The implication that Abigail must have somehow obtained her ticket through means other than simply purchasing it. The suggestion that her presence itself violated some unspoken rule about who deserved premium treatment. Conversations in the nearby rows stopped. Abigail was aware of faces turning toward the galley, passengers beginning to pay attention to the confrontation. Aaron from 2B was already reaching for his phone. The woman in row 1 had her tablet angled toward the galley, possibly recording. The couple in row 4 had stopped mid-conversation to watch. Good, Abigail thought distantly. Witnesses matter. Documentation matters. Because without them, this becomes her word against 4 crew members, and she knew how that equation usually resolved. Abel stepped forward, inserting himself between Ada and Abigail. "Ma'am, if you can't follow crew instructions, we may need to have the captain involved." Crew instructions. As if asking for water after 2 hours of deliberate neglect constituted some violation of federal aviation regulations. Adelaide added her voice, speaking loudly enough to ensure the surrounding rows could hear. "Some people think buying a ticket means they own the plane. Some people." The phrase that bigots use when they want to express prejudice without naming it directly. Some people play loud music. Some people are always late. Some people don't know how to behave. Everyone knows exactly which people they mean, but the vagueness provides plausible deniability. Except there was nothing deniable about this situation. The targeting was obvious, the discrimination was blatant, the racism was on full display for anyone willing to see it. Aaron from 2B appeared behind Abigail in the aisle. She hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, tall and solid and clearly angry. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said, addressing Ada directly. "I'm witnessing discrimination." Ada's confidence flickered for the first time, her eyes moving from Abigail to Aaron and back. "Sir, please don't involve yourself in matters you don't understand." The dismissal was automatic, the assumption that a white man couldn't possibly comprehend what he was seeing. But Aaron didn't back down. "I understand perfectly. I've watched you ignore this woman for 2 hours while serving everyone else multiple times. I've watched you refuse her food when you clearly had meals available. I've watched you make racist comments and deny her basic service." His voice grew louder with each sentence, carrying through the cabin. More passengers were paying attention now. The woman in row 1 stood up. "He's right," she called out. "I've been watching too. This is disgusting." The man from row 4 already had his phone raised, recording. "I'm documenting this," he announced. "This is racial discrimination, and I'm capturing every word." The dynamic in the cabin shifted like pressure equalizing. Suddenly the flight attendants weren't dealing with one black woman they could easily dismiss. They were facing multiple white passengers willing to use their privilege as a weapon against injustice, willing to spend their social capital to defend someone being treated unfairly. Ada's face went from confident to uncertain, her eyes darting among the various passengers now engaged in the situation. She'd lost control of the narrative, lost the ability to frame this as a difficult passenger rather than discriminatory crew. "Everyone needs to calm down and return to their seats," she tried, her voice lacking its earlier authority, "or we'll divert this flight." Aaron laughed, actually laughed, at the empty threat. "Please do divert. I'd love to explain to airport authorities why. The challenge hung there, and Ada had no response. What could she say? That she'd diverted a flight because passengers objected to watching a black woman be denied water and food for over 2 hours. That would look even worse than the situation already did. Abigail remained still through all of this, letting the white passengers fight the battle she'd been fighting alone. It shouldn't require white validation for her mistreatment to matter, but she was practical enough to accept the help when it came. Ada made a fatal error then. Perhaps flustered by the multiple challenges, perhaps angry at losing control, perhaps just revealing what had been in her heart all along. She leaned close to Abigail, close enough that her breath moved the air between them, and spoke in a voice that she probably thought was quiet but carried to at least 6 nearby passengers. People like you shouldn't be in first class anyway. You clearly can't afford it. Silence fell like a hammer. Complete, total silence. Even the ambient aircraft noise seemed to diminish in the face of such blatant racism. 5 passengers had phones out now, all recording, all capturing the moment. Aaron immediately reached for the flight attendant call button, pressing it repeatedly. "I need to speak to the captain," he said loudly, firmly. "Right now." Ada's face went from red to pale, finally seeming to realize the magnitude of her mistake. But the words couldn't be taken back. They existed now, recorded, witnessed, undeniable. The mask had fallen completely away, and everyone could see exactly what had been underneath all along. The captain's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, calm and authoritative over the intercom. "Lead flight attendant to the cockpit immediately." For words that shifted everything. Ada's expression transformed from defensive aggression to something approaching fear. She glanced at her fellow crew members as if seeking support or strategy, but Abel, Aaron, and Adelaide suddenly found various tasks that required their complete attention. The lead flight attendant was on her own. She smoothed her uniform, lifted her chin in a gesture that tried for dignity but achieved only desperation, and walked toward the cockpit. Every passenger in first class watched her progress down the aisle. Some with satisfaction, some with curiosity, all with the knowledge that something significant was happening. The cockpit door opened, and Ada disappeared inside. The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded final. 5 minutes passed. Abigail returned to her seat, less out of compliance than out of exhaustion. Her head still throbbed, her stomach still ached, and now adrenaline from the confrontation was making her hands shake slightly. Aaron from 2B leaned over. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. The concern in his voice was genuine, and Abigail appreciated it even as she resented needing it. "I will be," she replied, because that was always true eventually. She'd survived worse than hostile flight attendants. She'd built a company in an industry that consistently tried to exclude her. This was just another chapter in a very long story. The cockpit door opened again. Ada emerged, and the change in her demeanor was immediate and striking. The color had drained from her face, leaving her skin chalky and pale. Her hands trembled visibly as she gripped the cockpit doorframe for support. Her earlier confidence and aggression had evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked like shock or fear or both. She walked down the aisle like someone moving through water, each step requiring conscious effort. When she reached row 2, she stopped. Her voice, when she spoke, was small and forced, each word seeming to cost her something. "Ma'am, the captain would like to speak with you." Now do you think Abigail should go to the cockpit, or do you think she should refuse and demand they handle it right there in front of everyone? Comment the number 1 if you believe she should go speak privately with the captain, or comment the number 2 if you think she should make them address it publicly. And while you're deciding, smash that like button if you're glad those passengers stood up for what's right, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the captain gets involved. Seriously, what comes next is going to blow your mind. Will the captain side with the crew, or is Ada's career about to end at 35,000 feet? Let's find out. Abigail unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Every eye in the cabin followed her as she walked down the aisle toward the cockpit. The door was already open, held by a woman in a captain's uniform with 4 stripes on her shoulders. Ms. Thompson, please come in, the captain said, her voice warm in contrast to everything Abigail had experienced in the cabin. Abigail stepped into the cockpit, a space she'd never seen during a flight. The instrument panels glowed with hundreds of indicators, the windscreen showed endless sky and clouds, and 2 pilot seats dominated the cramped area. The captain closed the door behind them, creating privacy from the watching passengers. I'm Captain Adriana Rodriguez, the woman said, extending her hand. Abigail shook it, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Rodriguez was perhaps in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that conveyed both authority and empathy. I need to ask you something, and please forgive me if I'm wrong. Are you the Abigail Thompson, CEO of Thompson Tech Solutions? The question surprised Abigail. In her exhausted, hungry, dehydrated state, she'd almost forgotten her professional identity. She'd been so focused on just being treated like a human being that her accomplishments had faded into irrelevance. Yes, she confirmed simply. I am. Captain Rodriguez closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they held a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. My daughter works for your company. She's told me about you. She's a junior developer, started 8 months ago, and she says you personally mentored her during her onboarding. The coincidence was so unlikely it almost made Abigail laugh. Of course. Of course the captain's daughter worked for Thompson Tech. The universe had a sense of irony. What's her name? Abigail asked. Carmen Rodriguez, the captain replied. You probably mentor so many people you don't remember, but she talks about you constantly. About how you make time for new employees, especially women of color. About how you've created a culture where she feels valued and respected. The words landed with weight. Abigail did remember Carmen, actually. Brilliant programmer, shy at first but gaining confidence, Latina woman navigating the same tech industry spaces Abigail had fought through. She'd taken Carmen to lunch 3 times, reviewed her code, introduced her to senior engineers, done the things she wished someone had done for her 20 years ago. And now Carmen's mother was flying this plane, had just learned her flight crew had spent 2 hours discriminating against the woman who'd shown her daughter kindness. When I heard the commotion over the cabin audio system, Rodriguez continued, I checked the passenger manifest. When I saw your name, I couldn't believe my crew would treat you this way. Abigail held up a hand gently. Captain, with respect, this isn't about who I am. It's about how they treated a paying passenger. It would be wrong regardless of my identity or position. Rodriguez nodded slowly, her expression showing deep respect. You're absolutely right. But it does make their behavior even more shocking, and I'll tell you why. She pulled out a tablet, showing Abigail a screen with account information. Do you know that your company is this airline's largest corporate account? Thompson Tech Solutions books over 12,000 flights annually with us. That's worth approximately $8 million to our airline. The irony was so thick Abigail could taste it. The crew had spent 2 hours treating her like she didn't belong in first class, like she couldn't afford the ticket, like she was somehow less than. And the entire time, her company's travel budget was helping keep this airline profitable. I didn't mention my company affiliation, Abigail said quietly, because passengers shouldn't need corporate leverage to receive basic human dignity. That's exactly the problem. Rodriguez's respect for her seemed to deepen. I've already contacted headquarters, the captain said. They're reviewing the surveillance footage from the cabin cameras right now. Everything that happened out there was recorded. Every interaction, every bypass, every comment. Abigail felt something shift in her chest. Evidence. Documentation. Not just her word against 4 crew members, but objective video proof of everything that had occurred. I'm filing a formal report, Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. This crew will be suspended immediately upon landing. Possibly terminated, depending on what headquarters decides after reviewing the footage. The word should have brought satisfaction, but Abigail felt only complicated emotions. She'd never wanted people to lose their jobs. She just wanted to be treated fairly, to receive the service she'd paid for, to exist in a space without being constantly reminded that some people thought she didn't belong. Captain Rodriguez seemed to read her expression. Don't feel guilty, she said firmly. This isn't your fault. You didn't cause this. This is about their choices, their actions, their prejudice. They created this situation, not you. She paused, then added, and I need you to know, this isn't the first complaint about Ada. There have been 3 other incidents in the past 18 months. All from passengers of color. All dismissed by management as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. The revelation made Abigail's jaw tighten. Pattern, not isolated incident. Multiple people mistreated, multiple complaints filed, multiple warnings ignored. The airline had allowed this to continue until it escalated to this point. That's a systemic failure, Rodriguez said, anger creeping into her professional tone. My daughter is black and Latina. She faces this kind of treatment constantly in the tech industry, despite your best efforts to create an inclusive environment at Thompson Tech. And she faces it in the world, in stores and restaurants and on public transportation. I won't tolerate it on my aircraft. 2 women of color, different generations, different career paths, connected by shared understanding of what it meant to navigate spaces that weren't designed for them. Abigail felt the alliance form between them, wordless but solid. I need to ask, Rodriguez said, are you comfortable returning to your seat? I can offer to move you to a different section if you prefer, though legally you're entitled to the seat you purchased. Abigail considered for a moment, then shook her head. I'll return to my seat. I have nothing to be ashamed of. I belong in 2A because I paid for 2A. That's the beginning and end of the conversation. Rodriguez smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. Carmen was right about you. She said you never back down from what's right. The captain moved to the intercom, pressing the button that would broadcast throughout the cabin. Her voice, calm and authoritative, filled the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to serious crew misconduct, there will be personnel changes upon landing. Corporate headquarters has been notified and is currently reviewing the situation. All cabin service is suspended for the remainder of this flight while we address these matters. We apologize for this unprecedented situation and appreciate your patience and understanding. The announcement finished, and Rodriguez turned back to Abigail. They'll know something serious is happening now. And when we land, there will be consequences. She opened the cockpit door, and Abigail stepped back into the cabin. What happened next, she never could have anticipated. The entire first-class cabin erupted into applause the moment Abigail emerged from the cockpit. The sound was sudden and overwhelming, passengers rising from their seats in a spontaneous standing ovation that seemed to surprise everyone including themselves. Aaron from 2B was on his feet immediately, clapping loudly, his face showing a mixture of satisfaction and vindication. The woman from row 1 who'd been one of the first to speak up was applauding while wiping tears from her eyes. The couple from row 4 stood together, the man still holding his phone up to capture the moment. Even passengers from economy class who'd heard the commotion had crowded near the curtain, joining the applause when they saw what was happening. Abigail stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the public support, by the visible solidarity from complete strangers who'd chosen not to be passive witnesses to injustice. She walked slowly back toward row 2, and as she passed each row, passengers reached out to touch her arm, to nod, to offer quiet words of encouragement. Thank you for standing up, someone said. That took courage, another voice added. We're with you, came from behind her. The flight attendants watched from the galley, their earlier hostility replaced by visible distress. Ada stood with her back pressed against the wall, her face a mask of humiliation and barely controlled rage. Abel stared at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Aaron, the male flight attendant, had his arms crossed tightly as if trying to hold himself together. Adelaide's eyes were red-rimmed, tears threatening to spill over. As Abigail settled back into seat 2A, the woman from row 1 approached. She was perhaps in her 60s, well-dressed in a designer pantsuit, with gray hair styled elegantly. "Excuse me," she said quietly, leaning into Abigail's row. "I recorded everything on my tablet. The entire interaction, all the comments, everything. I'm sending it to the airline, and if you need it, I'm posting it online." She handed Abigail a business card. "I'm Margaret Chen, retired attorney. If you need witness statements or any legal support, please don't hesitate to contact me." Abigail took the card, moved by the offer. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotions she was trying to keep controlled. "That means more than you know." The man from row 4 appeared next, introducing himself as David Patterson, corporate attorney with a firm Abigail actually recognized. "What they did was textbook discrimination," he said bluntly. "Multiple witnesses, documented pattern of behavior, clear racial animus. If you decide to pursue any action, you have an airtight case." He gave her his card as well. "I specialize in civil rights law. Pro bono if needed. This is the kind of case that matters." One by one, passengers approached. Some offering support, some sharing their own stories of discrimination, some simply wanting to say they'd witnessed something wrong and hadn't stayed silent. The organic solidarity, the willingness of strangers to get involved, to use their voices and their privilege and their phone cameras to fight against injustice, moved Abigail more than she expected. Meanwhile, in the galley, the crew's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Abigail could hear snippets of frantic whispered conversations. "But we didn't know who she was," Abel's voice, defensive and frightened. "This is going to ruin everything," Adelaide, crying now. "Maybe if we apologize," Aaron the flight attendant, grasping at solutions that no longer existed. "It's too late for that," Ada, bitter and angry, her tone suggesting she blamed everyone except herself. She was on her phone, probably talking to union representation or headquarters, her body language broadcasting desperation. Their concern wasn't about their actions being wrong. Their concern was about being caught, about facing consequences, about their careers ending. Not once did any of them seem to grasp the fundamental cruelty of what they'd done. Aaron from 2B returned to his seat and pulled out a bottle of water from his personal carry-on. "Here," he said, handing it to Abigail. "I'm sorry I didn't do more earlier. I should have spoken up the first time I saw them skip our row." Abigail accepted the water gratefully, her throat still dry despite everything else happening. "You did enough," she told him honestly. "You spoke up. You used your voice and your privilege to help. That matters more than you know." She drank deeply, the cool water soothing her throat and beginning to ease the headache pounding behind her eyes. Simple hydration, basic human need, something she'd been denied for over 2 hours because of the color of her skin. "I've taken hundreds of flights," Aaron said quietly, staring at his hands. "Business travel, always first class. And I've never noticed this happening. But now I can't unsee it. How many times did I watch flight crews treat passengers differently and just not register it because it wasn't happening to me?" The question was rhetorical but important. "That's the invisibility of privilege," Abigail responded, her voice gentle but firm. "You weren't looking for it because it doesn't happen to you. But once you see it, you can't pretend anymore. That's when you have to decide what kind of person you want to be." Aaron nodded slowly, processing the weight of that truth. He pulled out his phone and began typing. "I'm the VP of a consulting firm," he explained as he typed. "We spend about $3 million annually on corporate travel. This airline won't get our business anymore unless they make real, demonstrable changes to their policies and training. He showed Abigail the email he was drafting to his company's travel coordinator and CFO. "It's not much, but it's what I can do." Economic pressure, the language corporations understood best. Abigail felt a grim satisfaction watching the ripples spread. Multiple passengers were on their phones now, contacting their companies, their social media followers, their networks. The crew's actions weren't just affecting their own jobs anymore. The consequences were expanding, touching the airline's reputation, its revenue, its future. Ada attempted damage control, gathering her courage and approaching row 2 with what looked like a prepared statement. "Ms. Thompson, I'd like to." She began, her voice carefully modulated to sound apologetic. Abigail held up one hand, stopping the flight attendant before she could continue. "Please don't," Abigail said firmly but not unkindly. "Anything you say now is only because you know who I am and what my company is worth to this airline. That's exactly the problem. I should have been treated with basic human dignity regardless of my name or my title or my company's account status." The devastating truth hung between them. Ada opened her mouth, closed it, tried again, and failed. There were no words that could fix what she'd revealed about herself, about her values, about what she truly believed. She retreated back to the galley, defeated and diminished. Abigail's phone buzzed with an incoming email. She glanced at the screen and felt her eyebrows rise. The email was from Jonathan Sterling, the airline's chief executive officer, sent to her personal email address, which meant someone had done research quickly. "Ms. Thompson, we have reviewed the cabin surveillance footage from your flight. Immediate action is being taken. Please accept our sincerest apologies and call me directly at your earliest convenience." The email included his personal cell phone number. The panic at the highest corporate level was palpable even through the sterile text of an email. An airline's CEO didn't give out his personal number lightly. This situation had clearly escalated to crisis management mode in the corporate offices. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into San Francisco. We should be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, this flight would end, but the consequences were only beginning." Abigail looked out her window at the clouds breaking apart below, revealing patches of land and water. San Francisco Bay glittered in the afternoon sun. The city waited, oblivious to the small drama that had played out at 35,000 feet. But it wouldn't stay small. She could feel the momentum building, the story taking on a life of its own. This was going to be bigger than one flight, bigger than 4 flight attendants, bigger than she'd ever intended. Sometimes standing up for basic dignity started avalanches. The descent into San Francisco felt slower than usual, or perhaps it was just Abigail's heightened awareness making every minute stretch. Through her window, she watched the landscape emerge from cloud cover, the distinctive shape of the bay coming into focus, the Golden Gate Bridge spanning impossibly across the water, the hills of the city rising up like waves frozen in time. The cabin had fallen into an unusual quiet, passengers absorbed in their phones and tablets, the earlier energy of support and confrontation settling into something more contemplative. Everyone seemed to sense they'd been part of something significant, a moment that would have consequences beyond this single flight. The flight attendants sat in their jump seats, required positions for landing, and Abigail could see their faces from her angle in row 2. They looked like people waiting for execution, pale and tense, occasionally whispering to each other but mostly sitting in isolated silence. Abel had been crying quietly, wiping his eyes with rough gestures that suggested anger mixed with grief. Adelaide stared blankly at nothing, her youthful face aged by stress and fear. Aaron, the male flight attendant, kept checking his phone despite regulations against it during landing, probably texting family or union representatives. And Ada sat rigid, her jaw clenched so tight Abigail could see the muscles jumping, her hands fisted in her lap, her eyes alternating between furious glares toward row 2 and fearful glances toward the cockpit door. Aaron from 2B leaned over slightly and spoke quietly enough that only Abigail could hear. They're not sorry for what they did. They're sorry they got caught. His observation was astute and accurate. Abigail had seen this pattern before in corporate settings, in board meetings, in situations where people's prejudices were exposed. The remorse was always about consequences, never about the fundamental cruelty of the actions. That's usually how it works, she replied, matching his quiet tone. Real change only comes with real consequences. People don't examine their biases when there's no cost to maintaining them. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and the engines reversed with their characteristic roar. San Francisco International Airport welcomed them with smooth runways and clear skies. But instead of taxiing toward the terminal, the plane turned onto a service road leading away from the main gates. Abigail noticed immediately and felt tension coil in her stomach. Through the window, she could see multiple airline vehicles waiting, security personnel in reflective vests, people in corporate attire standing beside black SUVs. An official reception committee, and not the welcoming kind. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be holding our position briefly before proceeding to the gate. There will be a slight delay in deplaning while we address the earlier incident. Thank you for your patience and understanding. The professional phrasing couldn't disguise the reality. Something was about to happen. The support from other passengers continued even as they prepared to deplane. Margaret Chen from row 1 approached again, this time with a small notebook filled with handwritten observations. I documented everything with timestamps, she explained. Every incident, every interaction, every discriminatory comment or action. It's all here if you need it. Her attorney training evident in the meticulous record-keeping. David Patterson, the civil rights lawyer from row 4, had printed something on his portable printer, an actual witness statement with his signature and bar number. Notarized as soon as we get inside, he said. I want there to be no question about what I observed. Other passengers offered similar support, contact information exchanged, promises to provide statements or testimony if needed. A young black woman emerged from economy class, having waited near the curtain for a chance to speak. She looked to be in her mid-20s, dressed in business casual attire, her natural hair worn in twists. Excuse me, Ms. Thompson, she said nervously. I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to say thank you. I saw everything from back there. We could hear the confrontation. And I wanted to thank you for not backing down. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. I face this kind of treatment constantly when I travel. But I never have the courage to say anything because I'm afraid of being labeled difficult or causing a scene or making it worse. You fought for all of us today. You showed me it's possible to stand up with dignity. The words hit Abigail harder than anything else that had happened. This was why it mattered. Not the personal vindication or the corporate accounts or even the justice of seeing discriminatory behavior punished. It mattered because young women like this were watching, learning, deciding how they would navigate a world that often treated them as less than. What's your name? Abigail asked. Jessica, the young woman replied. Jessica Martinez. Abigail pulled out one of her business cards and wrote her personal email on the back. Email me, she said. If you ever face discrimination and need support or resources or just someone to talk to who understands. And remember, you don't cause scenes by asking for basic respect. They cause scenes by denying it. That's never your fault. The aircraft door finally opened, but not to a jet bridge. External stairs had been rolled up to the plane, and through the opening, Abigail could see the delegation waiting at the bottom. 5 people in airline corporate attire, plus airport police in uniform, plus what looked like airline security. All looking grim and official. A tall man in his 50s with silver hair led the group up the stairs, his expression carefully neutral but his rapid pace suggesting urgency. Behind him came a woman in a sharp suit carrying a leather portfolio, a man with an ID badge marking him as legal counsel, another man with security chief visible on his credentials, and a woman whose HR director badge made her role obvious. The silver-haired man stopped at the entrance to the cabin, his eyes sweeping across the first-class passengers before settling on the flight attendants in their jumped seats. "I'm Richard Sterling, Vice President of Operations for the airline," he announced, his voice carrying authority. "I need to speak with Ms. Abigail Thompson first, and then we'll be addressing the flight crew." His gaze found Abigail in row 2. Ms. Thompson, on behalf of the entire airline, I cannot express how sorry we are for what you experienced on this flight. He approached her row, and Abigail stood to meet him. "I appreciate that, Mr. Sterling," she replied, keeping her voice measured and professional. "But I'm more interested in what you're going to do about it." Sterling nodded as if he'd expected exactly that response. He turned to face the flight crew, his expression hardening perceptibly. "Flight attendants Ada, Abel, Aaron, and Adelaide, please gather your personal belongings. You're being escorted from the aircraft and placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation." His words fell like hammer blows. Ada's face flushed red, then white. "But we didn't." She started to protest. Sterling cut her off with a sharp gesture. "We have complete video and audio footage from the cabin surveillance system. We've already reviewed it. There is no defense for your behavior." The HR director stepped forward, reading from a prepared document in a formal tone that made the words even more devastating. "Based on preliminary investigation into incidents occurring during Flight 743 from Atlanta to San Francisco, you are hereby suspended without pay effective immediately. Formal termination proceedings will be initiated and concluded within 72 hours pending union notification and review of evidence. You are required to surrender your airline identification, security badges, and uniform items before leaving the airport. For careers ending in real time. The weight of consequences becoming tangible." Abel broke down completely, covering his face with his hands. "I have 3 kids," he choked out. "I need this job. I've been with this airline for 12 years. The legal counsel responded without visible emotion. "You should have considered your family's needs before engaging in discriminatory behavior toward a passenger." Adelaide was crying openly now, mascara running down her face in dark streaks. "We made a mistake. Can't we just apologize? Can't we fix this?" But the HR director shook her head firmly. "This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are accidental. What occurred on this flight was a sustained pattern of deliberate discriminatory behavior lasting over 2 hours. That's not an error in judgment. That's a choice." Aaron, the male flight attendant, tried a different approach. "We didn't know who she was. We didn't know about her company or the corporate account." Sterling's voice went cold. "And that's precisely the problem. You treated a passenger with contempt and cruelty because you made assumptions based on her race. The fact that she happens to be a successful CEO doesn't make your actions worse. They were already indefensible." Airport security began the process of escorting the former flight attendants off the aircraft. As they gathered their belongings from the galley area, passengers watched in silence. Some faces showed satisfaction at seeing justice served. Others showed discomfort at witnessing people's careers destroyed. Most showed complex emotions, understanding the necessity while recognizing the human cost. As Ada passed row 2, she stopped. Despite security trying to hurry her along, she turned to look directly at Abigail. Her face contorted with anger and blame, her voice venomous even in defeat. "I hope you're happy," she spat. "You just destroyed 4 families. 4 people with children and mortgages and lives. I hope it was worth it to you." The attack hung in the air for a moment. Then Abigail met Ada's eyes calmly, her voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear. "No," she said. "You destroyed your own family when you chose racism over humanity. When you decided that a black woman didn't deserve basic service. When you made assumptions about who belongs in first class based on skin color. You did this. Your choices, your actions, your prejudice. I just asked for water. The simple truth of it was undeniable. Ada's face crumpled, the last of her defensive anger collapsing into the reality of her situation. Security moved her along, and the 4 former flight attendants descended the external stairs, crossed the tarmac, and disappeared into a waiting vehicle. Their airline careers over, their reputations destroyed, their futures uncertain. After the former crew had been removed, Sterling requested a private conversation with Abigail. They moved to a small office in the jet bridge, away from passengers and cameras, though Captain Rodriguez joined them in solidarity. The office was cramped and functional, smelling of recycled air and the faint chemical scent of industrial cleaner. Sterling closed the door and immediately the corporate veneer cracked slightly, showing genuine distress underneath. MS. Thompson, I need to be completely honest with you about what we discovered, he began, sitting heavily in one of the plastic chairs. The surveillance footage from your flight is damning. Every interaction, every bypass, every discriminatory comment captured on video. But what's worse is what we found when we dug deeper into the flight attendants' records. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression intense. I want to hear this too, she said. I've filed safety reports about crew attitudes affecting passenger well-being. They were dismissed as personality conflicts. Sterling nodded, acknowledging the implicit criticism. You were right, Captain. And we were wrong. He pulled out his tablet, showing them a file with multiple complaint records. Ada had 3 prior complaints from passengers. All filed in the past 18 months. All from passengers of color. He scrolled through the documents, and Abigail could see the pattern emerging. One complaint from a black businessman who reported being ignored during meal service. Another from an Asian woman who said Ada made comments about her English. A third from a Hispanic family who were questioned extensively about whether they'd purchased their first-class tickets legitimately. Why wasn't she fired after the first complaint? Abigail asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sterling had the grace to look ashamed. Union protections, insufficient evidence, benefit of the doubt. We prioritized avoiding conflict over protecting passengers. He met Abigail's eyes directly. Every single one of those passengers was telling the truth. Every single one of them experienced discrimination. And we failed them. We chose the path of least resistance, dismissed their concerns, let Ada keep flying. And by doing that, we enabled her behavior to continue and escalate until it reached what happened to you today. The admission of institutional failure was important, but it didn't undo the harm caused to those previous passengers. The other 3 crew members also had red flags in their files, Sterling continued. Nothing as extensive as Ada's record, but enough that someone should have noticed a pattern. Abel had 2 complaints about dismissive behavior toward passengers of color. Aaron had 1 incident where a Muslim passenger reported feeling profiled. Adelaide was new enough that she didn't have prior complaints, but her supervisor had noted concerns about her judgment in her 6-month review. He set down the tablet. We had all the warning signs. We had multiple opportunities to intervene. And we didn't. That's on us, on our management, on our policies that made it easier to ignore problems than address them. Captain Rodriguez added her perspective. I've been flying for 23 years. I've seen crew attitudes that concerned me. But when I filed reports, I was told I was being too sensitive, that I was seeing discrimination where there was just bad customer service. The institutional response taught me that speaking up was pointless. She looked at Sterling. Your airline has a culture problem, not just a problem with 4 flight attendants. The VP didn't argue. You're absolutely right. This incident is a symptom of a much larger systemic issue. And that's what we're committed to fixing. He turned to Abigail. Which brings me to why your situation is different from those previous complaints. You have resources, Sterling said bluntly. You have a platform. You're a CEO with business leverage and media attention and the ability to create real consequences. Those other passengers didn't have that. They filed complaints that disappeared into HR files. But your situation can't be dismissed or minimized. Not just because of who you are, but because you have witnesses, video evidence, and multiple passengers who are already contacting media outlets. He wasn't wrong, but the truth of it made Abigail uncomfortable. So justice depends on power and platform, she said quietly. The discrimination those other passengers faced was just as wrong. But because they couldn't create consequences, nothing changed. That's the brutal reality, Sterling acknowledged. And it's exactly what we need to change. Your situation is forcing us to confront failures we should have addressed long ago. He leaned back in his chair. Ms. Thompson, I know you're concerned about more than just your personal experience. You mentioned in the cabin that you wanted systematic change. I want to hear what that means to you. Abigail had been thinking about this during the flight, during the confrontation, during the aftermath. Real training, she said. Not a 2-hour PowerPoint presentation once a year. Actual anti-bias training with accountability. Independent review boards for discrimination complaints, not internal HR investigating their own colleagues. Zero-tolerance policies with clear consequences. Transparent reporting so passengers know complaints are taken seriously. Representation matters too, Captain Rodriguez added. Diverse crews, diverse management, diverse leadership. People are less likely to discriminate when they work alongside people from different backgrounds. When diversity is just a checkbox rather than a lived reality, bias flourishes. Sterling was taking notes on his tablet, nodding at each point. Everything you're saying aligns with what our consultant has been recommending for 2 years. We've been slow to implement because change is expensive and complicated and faces resistance. But after today, that resistance is going to evaporate. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create the political will for necessary changes. The conversation turned to public response and media strategy. Sterling asked about Abigail's plans for public statements. I'm going to speak truthfully about what happened, she told him directly. Not to destroy your airline, but to create change. If my story prevents this from happening to someone else, then something good comes from today. Sterling nodded slowly. We deserve whatever coverage comes from this. Our focus now is doing better, being better, creating systems that prevent this kind of discrimination. He paused, then added, you should know that multiple passengers from your flight have already posted videos online. The story is spreading rapidly on social media. By tonight, it will be national news. Abigail wasn't surprised. She'd seen the phones recording, watched passengers typing on their devices. Good, she said simply. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more people see what discrimination actually looks like, the harder it becomes to deny or minimize. Sterling agreed, though she could see the corporate crisis manager in him calculating the damage to the airline's reputation and stock price. But that wasn't her problem to solve. Her responsibility was to her own integrity, to the other passengers who'd experienced similar treatment, to the young women like Jessica Martinez who needed to see that standing up was possible. Captain Rodriguez shared her daughter Carmen's perspective. Carmen told me about working at Thompson Tech, about how you personally mentored her when she was struggling to navigate corporate culture as a woman of color. She said you taught her that she didn't have to choose between being professional and being authentic, that she could be both at once. The captain's voice grew emotional. My daughter faces microaggressions constantly. People assuming she's an administrative assistant instead of a developer. Comments about her accent even though she was born in California. Questions about diversity hires. You created a space where she felt valued for her skills and respected for who she is. That's the standard every workplace should meet. I succeeded because people helped me, Abigail said. I mentor others because it's right. That's not exceptional. That should be baseline behavior. But she knew it wasn't, knew that in most corporate environments, young women of color had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, had to prove themselves repeatedly, had to navigate bias and discrimination while being told they were imagining it. If this incident becomes a case study, she continued, if it becomes training material that teaches people to recognize discrimination and speak up against it, then something positive emerges from today's ugliness. Sterling revealed more about the airline's response. Your story is already being covered by CNN, NBC, and every major outlet. My office has received 47 interview requests in the past hour. The airline's CEO is flying to San Francisco tonight specifically to meet with you personally if you're willing. The scale of attention was becoming clear. This wasn't going to be a one-day story that disappeared. This was going to have legs, going to spark conversations, going to force institutions to examine their own practices. Abigail felt the weight of that responsibility but also the opportunity it represented. How many times had discrimination happened in silence, with no witnesses, no video, no consequences? Today, there were consequences. Today, the truth was visible. Exiting the aircraft felt like emerging from a pressure chamber into normal atmosphere. The jet bridge was crowded with airline employees, some offering assistance, others simply curious about the situation that had generated so much activity. Passengers from the flight moved past in a steady stream, many pausing to nod at Abigail, to touch her arm in support, to murmur words of encouragement. Erin from 2B stopped to shake her hand formally. I'm going back to my office and training every single employee in my company about what I witnessed today, he said with conviction. About recognizing discrimination, about using privilege to help others, about not being a passive bystander. Thank you for your dignity in the face of something so undignified. Margaret Chen from row 1 had tears in her eyes as she approached. I'm a retired high school teacher, she explained. I taught history and civics for 38 years. I'm going to use what happened today as a lesson about speaking up against injustice. You showed everyone on that plane how it's done. You stayed calm, you documented everything, you didn't meet cruelty with cruelty. That's powerful. She handed Abigail a handwritten note. My contact information and a timeline of everything I witnessed. Use it however you need. The generosity of strangers, the willingness to get involved, the recognition that silence makes us complicit in injustice. These were the things that gave Abigail hope even in the midst of exhausting circumstances. Jessica Martinez, the young black woman from economy class, was waiting in the terminal. She'd clearly been working up courage, standing near the gate area and watching for Abigail to emerge. When she saw her, Jessica approached hesitantly. Ms. Thompson, I waited because I needed to say this properly. I'm 24 years old. I graduated with an engineering degree 2 years ago. And I've faced discrimination in my professional life, in airports, in stores, everywhere. But I always stay quiet because I'm afraid. Afraid of being seen as angry or difficult. Afraid of making things worse. Afraid that no one will believe me. Her voice shook but grew stronger. You showed me today that speaking up is possible. That dignity doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. That we have a right to exist in these spaces without being made to feel less than. Thank you for fighting for all of us. The words broke something open in Abigail's chest. This was the real victory, not the firings or the policy changes or the corporate apologies. The victory was in the young women watching, learning, finding their own courage. Listen to me, Abigail said, taking Jessica's hands in hers. You didn't cause scenes by asking for respect. They caused scenes by denying it. That's never your fault. And you're not alone. There are more of us than you think, and we're fighting to make these spaces safer for people like you. She gave Jessica her card with her personal email. Stay in touch. And if you ever need support or resources or just someone who understands, reach out. That's what community means. The terminal was chaos. Media crews had gathered near the gate, cameras and microphones ready, reporters calling out questions. Airline security tried to manage the crowd, creating a pathway for Abigail to move through. But she made a decision. Instead of hiding, instead of rushing to a private car and avoiding the attention, she stopped. "I'd like to make a brief statement," she told the nearest security officer. Word spread quickly, and within 2 minutes, she was standing in front of a cluster of microphones and cameras, the kind of impromptu press conference that would be analyzed and quoted for days to come. She took a breath and began speaking, her voice calm and clear. "What happened to me today happens every day to countless people of color," she started. "The difference is I had witnesses. I had a platform. I had resources. Most people facing discrimination don't have those advantages." She paused, making sure her words were measured and purposeful. "This isn't about one flight attendant or one crew. This is about systems that enable discrimination, that excuse it, that look away from it even when evidence is presented. It's about institutions that prioritize avoiding conflict over protecting people." More cameras appeared, more reporters crowding closer. "I want real accountability. Real training. Real consequences. Not just at this airline, but across every industry. Because discrimination isn't limited to flights. It's in restaurants and stores and hospitals and schools and workplaces." A reporter called out a question about whether she would sue. Abigail shook her head. "That's not my priority right now. My priority is creating change so this stops happening. So that young women like Jessica, who I just met, don't have to choose between staying quiet and risking being labeled difficult. So that parents don't have to teach their children how to survive encounters where they're treated as less than human." Another question, this one asking about the terminated employees. "I don't celebrate anyone losing their job," Abigail said honestly. "But actions have consequences. Discrimination destroys lives too. It destroys dignity and mental health and sense of safety. Those consequences matter just as much as employment." One more question, from a reporter Abigail recognized from a major network. "Ms. Thompson, what do you want people watching this to know?" Abigail looked directly into the camera, knowing her words would reach beyond this terminal, beyond San Francisco, beyond this single moment. "Speak up. Use your voice. Don't be a passive witness to injustice. It doesn't matter if you're white or black or any other race. When you see discrimination happening, say something. Record it. Report it. Stand with the person being targeted. That's how change happens. Not through silence and comfort, but through discomfort and courage." The press conference ended, and she walked away from the microphones, aware that her words were already being transcribed and shared and quoted across social media platforms. The story went viral within minutes. Abigail's phone exploded with notifications as she made her way through the terminal. News outlets picking up the story. Social media platforms trending hashtags like #FirstClassDiscrimination and #FlyingWhileBlack. Comments and shares multiplying exponentially. Video clips from passengers showing different angles of the confrontation, creating a complete picture of what had occurred. Public opinion was swift and decisive. The overwhelming response supported Abigail, condemned the crew's actions, demanded accountability. But there were also the predictable voices claiming she was playing the race card, that she should have stayed quiet, that she'd overreacted. Those voices were quieter, drowned out by the evidence and the witnesses and the undeniable documentation. Corporate America responded rapidly. CEOs from competing airlines issued statements condemning discrimination and pledging to review their own policies. Major companies publicly backed Abigail, sharing their diversity initiatives while acknowledging that much work remained. Within hours, Thomson Tech's employee base had organized a solidarity campaign, making donations to civil rights organizations in Abigail's name. The economic impact began manifesting immediately. Aaron's consulting firm wasn't the only company pulling business from the airline. Within 24 hours, 3 major corporate accounts representing $15 million in annual travel spending had suspended their contracts pending satisfactory policy changes. The stock market responded too, the airline's share price dropping 3% in after-hours trading as investors calculated the reputational damage. The aviation industry scrambled to respond. Multiple airlines announced immediate reviews of their anti-discrimination policies. Training programs focused on implicit bias were fast-tracked. Industry conferences scheduled emergency sessions on diversity and inclusion. The Federal Aviation Administration indicated they would be issuing guidance on handling discrimination complaints. Sometimes crisis creates the momentum for changes that should have happened years earlier. Ada, Abel, Aaron, and Adelaide became cautionary tales, their terminations used in training materials about the cost of discrimination. Their union tried to defend them but found little public sympathy. The video evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious, the witnesses too numerous. Captain Adriana Rodriguez was promoted within the week. The airline recognized her integrity and leadership, making her the head of a newly created diversity initiative with substantial budget and authority. Her first action was implementing the changes Abigail had outlined, bringing in external consultants and creating independent review processes for discrimination complaints. The 8 passengers who'd served as witnesses each shared their perspectives with media outlets. Their stories were compelling, showing ordinary people choosing courage over comfort. Margaret Chen's teacher training showed in her articulate explanations of why bystander intervention matters. David Patterson's legal expertise lent credibility to the civil rights framework. Aaron from 2B became an unexpected voice for how white privilege could be used as a tool for justice rather than just passive benefit. 3 weeks after the incident, the airline's CEO issued a comprehensive public statement announcing sweeping changes. Mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, no exceptions. Independent review board for discrimination complaints with community members serving alongside airline representatives. Zero tolerance policy with immediate termination for violations, no warnings or second chances. Passenger Bill of Rights expanded to explicitly address discrimination. $50 million invested in diversity initiatives including recruiting, training, and cultural transformation. The changes weren't perfect, weren't complete, but they represented real movement. And they happened because one woman refused to accept being treated as less than human, and because witnesses chose to see and speak and stand with her. 3 months later, Abigail stood in line at Atlanta's airport again, same early morning departure time, same destination of San Francisco, same airline. She'd chosen deliberately to fly with them, wanting to see if the promised changes were real or just corporate performance. The check-in agent recognized her immediately. Abigail braced for awkwardness, but instead the woman's face showed genuine warmth. "Ms. Thompson, it's an honor to serve you today. Thank you for everything you've done to make our airline better." The sincerity in her voice suggested this wasn't scripted customer service but authentic gratitude. As Abigail moved through security and toward her gate, she noticed differences. Posters promoting the airline's new diversity initiatives. Staff wearing pins that said, "Every passenger matters." A prominent display near the gate with information about how to report discrimination and guarantees of investigation. Boarding began, and Abigail presented her ticket for seat 2A. Full circle, reclaiming the space where her dignity had been challenged. The flight attendant greeting passengers was a young black man with a warm smile and professional demeanor. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Thompson," he said. "I'm Jerome, and I'll be serving your section today. Please let me know if you need anything during the flight." Another flight attendant, an Asian American woman, helped with her carry-on. The captain's voice came over the intercom before takeoff, and Abigail felt surprise hearing the name. "Good morning, this is your captain, Aiko Chin. We're honored to have you aboard today." A woman's voice, an Asian American name, representing the kind of diversity that had been missing from airline cockpits for too long. The flight itself was unremarkable, which was exactly the point. Abigail received the same attentive service as every other first-class passenger. No one questioned whether she belonged. No one made her wait while serving everyone else. When she pressed the call button for water, Jerome appeared within a minute with a smile and a bottle and an offer of anything else she might need. The meal service included everyone, no rows skipped, no discriminatory patterns. Professional hospitality extended equally regardless of race or class or appearance. This was how it should have been all along. Basic human dignity as the baseline rather than the exception. Mid-flight, Jerome approached her row during a quiet moment. "Ms. Thompson, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to thank you personally. I'm one of 50 new diverse hires the airline made in the past quarter. Before the changes you inspired, I'd applied here 3 times and never gotten past initial screening. I was convinced this airline's culture was hostile to people who looked like me." His voice was quiet but intense. "After what happened to you, after the policy changes and new leadership focus on diversity, they recruited me. I just completed training last month. I love this job. And I might not have it if you hadn't stood up." The conversation was interrupted by Abigail's phone buzzing with an email. She glanced at the screen and saw a quarterly report from Richard Sterling, the VP she'd met on that first flight. The changes weren't just symbolic, the data showed. Discrimination complaints were down 75% compared to the same period last year. Employee satisfaction surveys from minority staff showed significant improvement. Passenger feedback specifically mentioning inclusive service had increased dramatically. Customer retention among corporate clients of color was improving after years of decline. The numbers told a story of real cultural transformation, not just policy window dressing. Another email caught her attention, this one unexpected and moving. It was from a woman named Sarah, who identified herself as Ada's daughter. "Ms. Thompson, I don't expect you to read this or respond. But I needed to write it. My mom lost her job because of her choices. Our family went through hell. We had to sell our house. Mom's marriage fell apart. Everything changed." Abigail braced for blame and anger, but the email continued. "But maybe she needed to lose everything to see what she'd become. We're in family therapy now, talking about racism we never acknowledged. Mom is confronting beliefs she learned from her parents and never questioned. It's hard and painful and necessary. I don't think she would have done this work if there hadn't been serious consequences. So thank you for not letting it slide. Thank you for creating consequences that forced her to change." The complexity of redemption, the reality that even those who caused harm could grow, though growth didn't erase the hurt or excuse the actions. Abigail felt a complicated mix of emotions reading the email. She hoped Ada found healing and transformation. She also knew that Ada's path to growth had been paved with the pain she'd inflicted on others. Both things could be true simultaneously. She saved the email, unsure if she'd respond but moved by the daughter's courage in reaching out. Aaron from the consulting firm had sent updates too. His company now had supplier diversity requirements and actively sought out minority-owned businesses for partnerships. He'd become an advocate for racial justice in corporate spaces, using his platform and privilege to amplify voices that might otherwise be ignored. The 8 witnesses from that original flight had formed an ongoing advocacy group. They spoke at corporations about active allyship, about not being passive bystanders to injustice. Margaret Chen's teaching materials about the incident were being used in high schools across the country. David Patterson had taken on 3 discrimination cases pro bono, representing clients who couldn't afford legal fees. The ripples continued spreading in directions Abigail never anticipated. She'd received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of discrimination, finding courage in her example, demanding respect in their own lives. Young women like Jessica Martinez who now spoke up when treated unfairly. Parents who taught their children that dignity wasn't negotiable. Allies who used their privilege to challenge injustice rather than benefit from silence. Captain Rodriguez's new training program had become mandatory across the industry. Using Abigail's incident as a case study, the curriculum trained thousands of aviation professionals about recognizing and responding to discrimination. The program didn't just focus on obvious racism but addressed microaggressions, implicit bias, and the cumulative weight of small indignities. Early results showed measurable improvement in how complaints were handled and resolved. Other industries took notice. Hotels implemented similar programs. Retail companies revised their policies. The hospitality sector as a whole began examining practices that enabled discrimination to flourish. Economic pressure combined with social awareness to create momentum for change. Abigail had been invited to speak at the annual Aviation Industry Conference, addressing 1,500 executives and leaders. She'd shared the full story, not just the confrontation but the context. The years of similar experiences, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove she belonged, the emotional labor of maintaining dignity while being treated with contempt. Change seemed impossible until it was necessary, she'd told them. Crisis revealed character. Character demanded action. Action created transformation. But transformation is ongoing work, not a destination. You can't declare victory and return to comfortable complacency. You have to keep examining, keep adjusting, keep holding yourselves accountable. The standing ovation had lasted 5 minutes. Executives who'd initially been defensive about their own company's practices found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. Some changes happened immediately. Others would take years. But the conversation had shifted from whether discrimination existed to how to eliminate it. From protecting institutions to protecting people. From punishing those who reported problems to punishing those who created them. Progress, imperfect but real. Thomson Tech had grown too, strengthened by its leaders' public stand. Employee retention improved. Recruitment became easier as talented professionals sought out companies with demonstrated commitment to inclusion. Client relationships deepened as corporate values aligned. The company's reputation for integrity translated into business advantages, proving that doing right wasn't just morally correct but economically smart. Personally, Abigail received hundreds of messages weekly. Some from people sharing their stories, finding community in shared experience. Others from young women seeking mentorship or advice. Several from parents asking how to talk to their children about discrimination. And many from people who'd witnessed the incident or heard about it and wanted to thank her for speaking up. One message particularly touched her, from a 12-year-old black girl named Amara. I saw what happened to you on the news. I saw you stay calm even when people were being mean. I saw you speak up without yelling. When kids at school are racist to me, I remember you. I speak up too. Thank you for showing me how. The flight began its descent into San Francisco. Through her window, Abigail watched the familiar landscape emerge, the bay glittering in afternoon sun, the city rising up to meet them. The smooth landing drew polite applause, appreciation for Captain Chen's skilled flying. Deplaning was routine, flight attendants offering genuine smiles and thanks for flying with them. Simple interactions, respectful exchanges, dignity as baseline. Abigail walked through the terminal, passing the same spots where months ago she'd held an impromptu press conference. Now the space was just a terminal again, travelers moving purposefully toward their destinations. She noticed the airline's promotional posters had changed. The images now showed diverse passengers and crew, people of all backgrounds, the tagline reading, "Everyone deserves respect at 35,000 feet and everywhere else." Marketing that reflected genuine values rather than empty performance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Captain Rodriguez. Just heard you landed safely. Hope the flight met your expectations. Carmen says hello and thanks you for the recommendation letter. Stanford accepted her for their graduate program in computer science. Your mentorship changed her life. Abigail smiled, typing a quick response. The flight was perfect. Tell Carmen I'm proud of her and she earned that acceptance through her own brilliance. Let's have dinner next time I'm in town. As she walked toward baggage claim, Abigail thought about Ada, Abel, Aaron, and Adelaide. Their lives had been permanently altered by their choices on that flight. She didn't celebrate their suffering, but she didn't regret the consequences either. Actions mattered. Choices had weight. You couldn't treat people cruelly without cost. She thought about the 3 passengers who'd filed complaints before hers, whose reports had been dismissed, whose pain had been minimized. Justice delayed for them, but perhaps prevented for others going forward. She thought about Jessica Martinez and the young girl Amara and all the others watching, learning that speaking up was possible. Her briefcase held a folder labeled "Speaking Engagements," with 47 requests from organizations wanting to hear her story. Universities, corporations, nonprofits, community groups. Each invitation representing people committed to fighting discrimination, to creating more inclusive spaces, to ensuring that basic dignity wasn't a privilege but a right. She didn't feel like a hero. Heroes seemed larger than life, special somehow. She felt like someone who'd simply said, "enough," when faced with unacceptable treatment. Sometimes that's exactly what heroism looked like. Not grand gestures but small acts of courage that refused to accept injustice as normal. An email notification appeared, this one from a major airline competitor. "Ms. Thompson, we're embarking on a comprehensive review of our diversity and inclusion practices. Your expertise would be invaluable. Would you be willing to consult with our leadership team? Compensation negotiable." She flagged it to review later, amused by how her refusal to accept discrimination had become a marketable skill. But if her experience could help improve systems, could prevent others from facing similar treatment, then the consultation was worthwhile. The work continued. The fight went on. Progress was incremental and exhausting and absolutely necessary. Abigail stepped out of the airport into California sunshine. The air was cool despite the brightness, carrying the salt smell of the bay. She pulled out her phone one more time, looking at the growing list of messages and requests and opportunities that had emerged from that single flight 3 months ago. People asking for her advice, her time, her voice. Organizations wanting her expertise. Young women seeking mentorship. Media requesting interviews. The attention was overwhelming sometimes, but it also represented possibility. Every conversation was a chance to create change. Every speech reached people who might then examine their own biases. Every story shared gave courage to someone facing similar circumstances. So where do you stand on all this? Was Abigail right to push for the crew's termination, or should there have been a path to redemption without job loss? Comment below with your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about how you'd respond to witnessing discrimination, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to our channel because we'll keep bringing you stories about courage, justice, and standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Thank you for watching, for listening, for caring about these issues that affect real people every single day. Remember that your voice matters, your actions matter, and together we can create a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Until next time, stay strong, speak up, and never accept less than basic human respect. We're all in this together. This story reveals powerful truths about discrimination, accountability, and courage that resonate far beyond a single flight. First, discrimination thrives in silence. When passengers witnessed injustice and chose to speak up, document evidence, and stand in solidarity, they transformed an individual experience into collective action. Silence protects perpetrators, but voices create change. Second, consequences matter. The crew's termination wasn't revenge but accountability. Without real costs for discriminatory behavior, systems remain unchanged and victims continue suffering. Third, privilege becomes power when used intentionally. White passengers leveraging their voices and credibility to validate Abigail's experience demonstrated active allyship, showing that privilege can be a tool for justice rather than passive benefit. Fourth, institutional failures enable individual prejudice. The airline's history of dismissing complaints allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked until crisis forced transformation. Fifth, documentation is crucial. Video evidence, witness statements, and detailed records turn subjective experiences into undeniable facts. Sixth, representation creates cultural shift. Diverse hiring and inclusive leadership don't just check boxes but fundamentally transform workplace dynamics. Finally, speaking up requires courage but creates ripples that extend far beyond the initial moment. Abigail's refusal to accept mistreatment inspired countless others to demand dignity, proving that individual acts of courage can catalyze widespread social change when amplified by community support and institutional accountability. What would you have done if you were a passenger on that flight? Would you have spoken up immediately, stayed silent, or recorded the incident? Comment below and let us know. If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of race or background, smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to understand what discrimination really looks like and why speaking up matters. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss powerful stories about justice, courage, and standing up for what's right. Your engagement helps these important conversations reach more people who need to hear them. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of a community that refuses to accept injustice. Remember, change starts with awareness, grows through conversation, and becomes reality through action. Every voice matters, including yours. Until next time, keep fighting for dignity, keep speaking truth, and keep believing that a better world is possible when we all commit to creating it together. Stay blessed and stay strong.